welcome to my presentation. My name is Annelise Klettner. I am a current graduate student at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. I'm interested in cultural orientation and how that plays a role in adolescent development. And today I will be giving a presentation on the role of individualism and collectivism in the link between parental control and depression in Chinese adolescents. So I'm going to just start in giving a brief background overview of adolescence. Adolescence is a critical developmental period of personal growth, psychosocial adjustment, and emotional and cognitive transitions. And so many children, of course, as they go into adolescence, they gain more independence, making more decisions, they spend more time outside the home, and communicate less frequently with parents. And so during this developmental period, there is this increased desire for autonomy. And this, of course, can influence parent-child interactions and create tension between parents and children as children try to gain more independence and parents are trying to at least enforce some type of discipline over what their adolescent does. And so this can create some conflict. And so it's important to study the role that parental control plays on an adolescent mental health and well-being. And so parental psychological control is a common concept that has been studied in a lot of research. And it's basically a type of parental control that employs psychological methods to control an adolescent's thoughts, emotions, and sense of self, which can be very harmful for an adolescent, especially if they are trying to fulfill a sense of purpose and find a sense of self-direction and make more decisions on their own without the influence of their parents. And so a lot of times parental psychological control can manipulate the child's thoughts and emotions. Examples could be invalidating them or invalidating their personal wants and desires, inducing guilt, anxiety, or shame, or withdrawing love. And so parental psychological control has been studied in many aspects in many different cultures. And so it has been shown that parental psychological control is related to a variety of maladaptive outcomes, including depression, anxiety, internalizing and externalizing disorders, aggressive behavior, lower self-esteem, and of course, lower academic achievement. And so a lot of the studies suggest that parental psychological control is a risk factor to adolescent well-being because it does restrict autonomy, but it restricts also a personal sense of autonomy. So that self-identity that we all adolescents try to achieve and when making their own decisions for themselves. Now, the problem with many of these studies is that they have been collected in Western parts of the world and focus less on Eastern cultures. And so the role of this study currently is to assess psychological control and depression in collectivistic cultures, which are usually in Eastern Asian cultures and more of the Chinese cultures. And so it's important to know what cultural orientation is when we're talking about in an adolescent's cultural value systems. So there are two types of cultural orientations. One is individualism and the other is collectivism. Individualism is placing an emphasis and value on independence and separating from one's group. So an adolescent that has high levels of individualism is going to value their personal autonomy to a much higher degree than someone that is a collectivism person. So, on the other hand, collectivistic oriented adolescents value interdependence over personal autonomy. And so any personal decisions that they may make are going to be inevitably tied to their groups and group norms. And so this can involve, taking their parents' decisions into their own decisions, or putting their parents' wishes and desires over the wishes of their own. And so this is more connected to what the group wants over what I want. And so there's a difference in this cultural orientation between adolescents, which can play a role in how they view parental control. So based on some of the research in terms of parental control and adolescent outcomes, We find that in more collectivistic cultures that place a higher emphasis on interdependence, there is greater parental psychological control that's found among these groups compared to individualistic groups. But overall, there is some mixed support for this link. And it's not entirely clear as to how parental control impacts collectivistic groups. So for example, in many studies, they have shown that higher parental control was related to higher depression among collectivistic samples. However, there are some studies that showed opposite, and that it did not result in more maladaptive outcomes for these adolescents. So for example, in Rudy and Halgunset's 2005 study, they collected data on collectivistic versus individualistic groups. And they found that when studying parental psychological control, collectivistic groups reported higher levels of psychological control when disciplining their adolescents. However, it did not result in more maladaptive outcomes for these people. So it's not entirely clear as to the level of impact or the severity of impact that collectivistic adolescents endure when they are under high levels of psychological control. Another limitation in a lot of these studies is that cultural orientation tends to be conceptualized as a dichotomous construct. So what that means is, for a lot of the methodology, a lot of researchers tend to group adolescents or children based on what's the more dominant cultural orientation they have. Are they collectivistic or are they individualistic? And so our study aimed to diversify this a little bit and add these two cultural orientations as coexisting independent variables, so that we can sort of assess parental control and depression and how cultural orientation plays a role at the individual level. And so it's possible that adolescents can have both varying degrees of individualism and collectivism. So our study looked at self-determination theory and applied this theory to our study. And the self-determination theory was first discovered by Deci and Ryan in 2000, and it argues that we have three basic needs. These three basic needs are autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And so for autonomy, especially very important in adolescents, adolescents value autonomy regardless of the culture that they're in. And so we see this across research, that regardless of what cultural background the adolescent comes from, it's pretty evident that autonomy, restriction of autonomy can be detrimental to their mental health. However, it's not clear as to the impact of parental control on mental health when considering one's culture. And so it may be less impactful in some cultures versus others. And so we predict that for adolescents that are higher on individualism, they're going to experience a much greater detrimental effect of parental control compared to an adolescent that would be more collectivistic. Now, for collectivism-oriented adolescents, they are going to value relatedness, which is related to interdependence and relying on connections with others. And so that's more of a relatedness issue with collectivistic-oriented adolescents. And so their autonomy restrictions are going to matter a lot less to them, because they are more influenced by interconnectedness and value that to a much more greater degree. And so for those that are higher on individualism, restriction of autonomy due to parental control is going to threaten their sense of self and self-esteem compared to those that are more collectivistic. So our current study examined the link between parental control and depression in Chinese adolescents. And we also examined the moderating role of these two cultural orientations in the link between parental control and depression. And then lastly, we tested the role of these cultural orientations at an individual level. So we did not dichotomize them, but rather we looked at them as two separate continuous constructs. So based on our model predictions, we predicted that higher levels of parental psychological control would be positively related to higher levels of adolescent depression. And we also predicted that individualism and collectivism would moderate this relationship, such that higher levels of individualism would strengthen this relationship and higher levels of collectivism would buffer this relationship. Our sample size included around 3,200 adolescents, which were recruited from middle schools and high schools from southern China. The chart shows of all the demographics that we covered. So the majority of adolescents were female. They were from an urban area. They had siblings. A lot of them had parents that were married and living together, and the majority reported living with both parents. And so the average age was also 15 years. So we had a pretty good sample size. The measures that we collected were their perception of their mothers and fathers' parental psychological control using a 21-item psychological control scale. We also collected their orientations of individualism and collectivism using a 16-item individualism and collectivism scale. And lastly, we recorded collected their reports of their depressive symptoms using the Revised Center for Epidemiologic Studies of Depression scale. So here are our results. So our model overall, our linear model, was significant. It accounted for 16% of the variance in depressive symptoms. And as you can see, the interaction effects were both significant. Parental control and individualism significantly interacted with depression, and parental control and collectivism also significantly interacted with depression. And that is after accounting for all the control variables that we included in our model. Now, if you look to the left graph where it shows individualism on parental control and depression, this is including a simple effects analysis. So when we parse out the simple effects of individualism, we find that adolescents who score higher on individualism were definitely more impacted by parental psychological control on their depressive symptoms. It had a much worsening effect compared to those that were low on individualism. For collectivism, we see the opposite effect. So high collectivism actually buffered the relationship between parental control and depression. Whereas those that had low levels of collectivism, you can see the relationship was a lot stronger. And so the results here conclude and suggest that collectivistic values buffer the negative impacts of parental psychological control on adolescent mental health. Whereas having a more individualistic oriented culture tends to exacerbate these negative impacts of parental control. So overall, parental psychological control tends to be a significant risk factor for adolescent depression, regardless of culture. And so this is because there's severe restrictions of autonomy that come with psychological control. Restricting one's autonomy can jeopardize well-being during adolescent development in all cultures. And cultural orientation moderates this relationship. So a stronger identity towards individualism is going to exacerbate the negative impact of control on depressive symptoms, whereas having a stronger identity towards collectivism is going to buffer the negative impact of parental control. So it's important to assess the degree to which adolescents identify with these two cultural value systems because they can create differential thresholds in need for autonomy and relatedness. So overall, our implications suggest that educators, parents, schools, teachers should be aware of these risks of psychological control to adolescent mental health, and especially in a collectivistic culture that is adopting more westernized views and cultural values. It's important for also future researchers to consider the importance of adolescent dual cultural values on control. And that way they can be more aware of cultural values that may impact other areas of an adolescent's life, including lifestyle, including behaviors. It's important to consider cultural orientation in a lot of different studies. And so that wraps up the end of my study. I want to thank you all for listening, and I hope you learned a lot. And thanks again. Take care.